Denise Thompson sat slouched on a threadbare couch, cigarette smoke curling around her like a shield, while her infant daughter, fragile and shivering, lay barely alive in a freezing, filthy room that smelled of mold and neglect. The winter in Brookhaven had settled in with an unforgiving grip. Frost coated the edges of the street, and the wind howled through the gaps in old buildings. At the far edge of the neighborhood, a house stood that seemed abandoned, its appearance matching the cold emptiness of the season. Windows were cracked, letting icy air seep inside, and the paint peeled in long strips from the weather-beaten walls. The yard was a chaotic mess, littered with broken furniture, torn trash bags, and scattered bottles, some half buried under the first layer of snow. Most people avoided walking past the property, giving it a wide berth as if instinctively sensing the neglect inside. But those who dared to glance closer could see smoke curling from a chimney that never warmed the house properly. Inside, the air was thick with the acrid stench of cigarette smoke. It clung to the furniture, the walls, and the filthy carpet, making every breath heavy and bitter. Trash was stacked in corners, forming piles of old newspapers, empty food containers, and discarded clothing. The smell of mold mingled with the smoke, creating a suffocating haze that settled over every room. In the far corner of the main room, a baby lay swaddled in a thin, tattered blanket. The infant shivered, small arms wrapped tightly around a fragile body, trying to generate warmth that the broken heater could no longer provide. Each breath seemed labored, the tiny chest rising and falling unevenly as the cold pierced through the thin covering. The mother, Denise, moved lazily on a worn couch, cigarette in hand. She inhaled slowly, her eyes glazed, barely registering the weak cries that echoed through the room. The smoke rose around her head, curling like a protective veil, separating her from the reality that existed just feet away. The baby's whimpers were soft, almost imperceptible at first, and then increasingly desperate, but they did not penetrate the fog of Denise's indifference. She had long grown accustomed to the chaos that surrounded her, the clutter, the stench, and the cold. It had become her normal, and in her mind, nothing else mattered. The house was silent except for the faint creaking of the floorboards under Denise's weight and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Outside, neighbors passed by, wrapped in coats and scarves, some casting wary glances at the dilapidated structure. Occasionally, a faint cry would escape through the thin walls, but most assumed it was just a momentary noise from an unruly household, not realizing the danger the infant faced. The baby's small hands twitched in the blanket, searching for warmth that never came, and a weak whimper slipped past tiny lips pale from cold. Time moved differently in the freezing house. Each minute stretched longer than it should, each breath more difficult than the last. As darkness fell, the temperature inside the house dropped further. The single light bulb in the ceiling flickered and swayed, casting eerie shadows over the piles of trash and the small form of the baby. Denise remained motionless, cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light. She took slow drags, exhaling smoke that lingered around her like a fog, ignoring the increasing cries that were becoming more strained and urgent. In that freezing, filthy house, the fragile life of the child hung in the balance, and the world outside carried on, unaware of the quiet horror hidden behind the cracked windows and broken door. The night pressed in, cold and silent, and the baby's shivering became the only sound that mattered, though no one inside seemed to notice. Denise's days had settled into a dangerous rhythm, a cycle of neglect and indulgence that left the baby at the mercy of a world the mother had long abandoned. The mornings were slow, stretching into afternoons as she lounged on the couch, cigarettes burning down in ashtrays that overflowed with gray remnants. The smell of smoke was everywhere, a permanent fixture of the house, clinging to Denise's hair and clothing and seeping into the thin blankets that barely covered the baby. Food was scarce. often limited to fast snacks, scavenged from convenience stores or leftovers that had long lost their freshness. The baby's cries were met with inattention, a distant awareness that failed to provoke action. Each weak whimper seemed to fade into the background, swallowed by the haze of smoke and the cluttered, suffocating atmosphere. Denise had secrets she guarded carefully, secrets that she told no one. Her days were not solely spent in passive neglect. She often left the house, vanishing into the night. She claimed to be working extra shifts, using the excuse to keep neighbors and family from questioning her absence. In reality, she had fallen into a life of petty crime, selling small items stolen from local stores to feed her growing dependence on cigarettes and alcohol. She carried herself through these activities with a careless confidence, a mask that hid the truth of her spiraling existence. Her habits had become more important than the baby's life, more compelling than the responsibility that should have defined her every action. Even when she remained inside, Denise existed in a fog of self-indulgence. The baby lay nearby, shivering beneath a threadbare blanket, the chill in the room seeping into fragile bones. Denise rarely noticed the gradual weakening of the child, the tiny body succumbing to the cold and hunger. She lit another cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled smoke that swirled around the room, obscuring the child from view. Time passed without acknowledgement, and the baby's soft cries grew more desperate, but Denise's attention was consumed by herself and her addictions. The house had become a prison, not for her alone, but for the infant who had no voice strong enough to demand care. The decay of the home mirrored the decay of Denise's priorities. Walls were streaked with mold, dishes piled high and rotting in the sink, and garbage overflowed into every corner. Each step through the house was a hazard, the floor littered with broken glass, twisted metal, and sharp debris. The baby's small cries were sometimes met with nothing more than a glance, an absent acknowledgement, before Denise returned to her cigarettes and fleeting moments of alcohol-induced relief. Friends and family had stopped checking in, and neighbors assumed someone else was attending to the child. In truth, no one was aware of the extreme neglect happening just yards from their doorsteps. Despite the constant danger, Denise seemed almost untouchable in her own mind, convinced that the world could not reach her, that her routines and habits were her only refuge. The baby's health declined steadily, a silent consequence of her choices. Skin grew pale, tiny hands stiffened from the cold, and the weak cries began to lose strength, fading into near silence. Each cigarette Denise lit was another act of disregard, another moment she chose indulgence over life. Her secret world of addiction and petty crime continued uninterrupted, while the baby's fragile existence hung by a thread in the freezing, filthy house that had become both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where life and neglect existed side by side, and the consequences were slowly catching up. Carla had always been a careful observer of the neighborhood, noticing details others overlooked. The house at the edge of the street had long been a source of quiet concern, but she had never seen inside. The windows were always dark, curtains tattered and half-fallen, hiding whatever went on behind them. Sometimes faint noises escaped through the walls, whimpers, the soft patter of a restless child. But neighbors dismissed them as echoes of normal family life, not realizing the danger within. Carla, however, felt a growing unease. There was something unnatural about the way the house seemed frozen in time, untouched except by neglect, yet alive with a subtle, troubling energy. One evening, she noticed movement through a cracked window. A pale glow from a cigarette illuminated a figure hunched over in the corner of the living room. Carla strained her eyes, trying to see more clearly, and then she saw the baby. The child was curled beneath a thin blanket, tiny arms shaking as it struggled against the cold. The faint light from the cigarette cast shadows over the infant's face, revealing the outlines of lips turning blue and tiny fists clenched in discomfort. Carla's heart raced as she realized the severity of the situation. She had feared neglect before, But the sight of the baby in that freezing, filthy room made her blood run cold. For a moment, she hesitated. Was it her place to intervene? What if she was wrong? The fear of making a false accusation gnawed at her, but it was quickly replaced by the undeniable sight of life fading before her eyes. The cries, once weak, had grown more desperate, almost pleading, and the baby's small body trembled uncontrollably. Carla could see that the child's warmth was vanishing, leaving only the chill of the broken home seeping into brittle bones. Denise remained oblivious, cigarette in hand, exhaling smoke as if it shielded her from reality. The mother's attention was consumed entirely by her own indulgence, leaving the infant's suffering unnoticed. Carla's mind raced as she weighed her options. She considered knocking on the door, calling the police, or perhaps trying to alert another neighbor, but fear and doubt delayed her. Minutes felt like hours as she watched from across the street, the baby's small form shivering more violently with each passing moment. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, the glow from the cigarette highlighting the grim contrast between the mother's indifference and the child's desperate need. The night air pressed in, carrying frost that seemed to invade even the warmth of the streetlights outside. Finally, Carla's hesitation broke. She could no longer stand by while the infant suffered. Her heart pounded as she dialed emergency services, trying to convey the urgency of the situation without exaggeration, knowing that every second counted. Behind her, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that its secrets were on the verge of being exposed. Inside, Denise remained frozen in her own world, cigarette smoke curling around her like a protective fog. The baby's cries, weaker now, echoed faintly into the night, a haunting reminder that life was slipping away. Carla waited, eyes fixed on the window, knowing that what happened next could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. By morning, the tension that had hung over the street for days reached its breaking point. Carla had made the call, and soon uniformed officers arrived, their presence casting a sudden sense of urgency over the frozen neighborhood. The house, which had always seemed like a forgotten relic, was now the center of intense scrutiny. Police moved quickly, their boots crunching against the frost-covered ground as they approached the broken front door. With a forceful push, it swung open, revealing the interior in all its shocking decay. The officers were met with a scene that words could barely capture. Piles of trash stacked high, old newspapers yellowed and crumbling, and the acrid smell of smoke so strong it made their eyes water. In the far corner of the room, the baby lay under the thin, tattered blanket. The infant's body was pale and stiff, small breaths coming in shallow gasps. The cold had seeped deep into fragile bones, leaving the child barely clinging to life. The officers immediately scooped up the infant, their hands steady but urgent as they assessed the situation. Every second counted. The baby was wrapped in warm blankets and rushed to the ambulance, the siren slicing through the stillness of the morning air. Inside the house, Denise remained seated on the couch, cigarette still in hand, the smoke curling lazily around her as though it formed a shield against the reality crashing into her world. She barely reacted to the chaos surrounding her, her eyes distant and unfocused, a woman trapped in a haze of her own making. The officers began to survey the home, documenting the extent of the neglect. Broken furniture, scattered debris, and mold-covered walls painted a grim picture of the environment in which the infant had lived. Hidden among the clutter, they discovered evidence of petty theft and drug use, small stacks of stolen items, and remnants of substances that explained some of Denise's erratic behavior. It became clear that the baby's suffering was not an isolated incident, but the result of a lifestyle steeped in self-indulgence and disregard for basic responsibility. Outside, neighbors gathered, their curiosity mingling with disbelief and horror. Murmurs spread quickly, the news of what had happened traveling faster than anyone could have imagined. People who had walked past the house countless times now realized how close tragedy had come, how silence and inattention had allowed danger to fester unchecked. Questions arose, some blaming Denise, others reflecting on their own inaction, wondering why no one had intervened sooner. The house, once ignored, had become a symbol of warning, a reminder of the consequences of neglect and the fragility of life. At the hospital, doctors worked feverishly to stabilize the baby. Every detail mattered: warmth, hydration, careful monitoring of vital signs. The infant's condition was critical, the effects of exposure to the cold and prolonged neglect leaving lasting consequences. Meanwhile, Denise was taken into custody, her blank stare betraying neither remorse nor recognition of the danger she had allowed to flourish. Her world, once defined by cigarette smoke and fleeting indulgence, had collided with reality, leaving a trail of consequences that could not be ignored. The discovery of the home's conditions, combined with the baby's critical state, made it clear that the negligence had reached a level of criminal recklessness. The line between life and death had been dangerously thin, and only swift intervention had prevented the worst from becoming irreversible. The aftermath of the rescue reverberated through Brookhaven, leaving the quiet town shaken and uneasy. News crews arrived, their cameras capturing the house in its ruined state and the small, fragile life that had been nearly lost inside. Reporters described the filth, the broken windows, and the overpowering smell of smoke and decay, painting a grim picture of neglect that stunned viewers. Social media buzzed with outrage and disbelief, neighbors and strangers alike questioning how a baby could have been left in such conditions, alone in a freezing house while the mother indulged in cigarettes and self-interest. The story spread rapidly, igniting conversations about responsibility, awareness, and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind closed doors. At the hospital, doctors continued their battle to stabilize the infant. The fragile body showed signs of both physical trauma and prolonged exposure to cold. Nurses worked tirelessly, wrapping the baby in warm blankets, monitoring every heartbeat and shallow breath, administering fluids and medications to stave off infection and organ failure. Each step was critical, a delicate balance between hope and the harsh reality that survival was uncertain. The small life hung in the balance, a reminder of how quickly negligence could escalate into near tragedy. Staff moved with precision and urgency, aware that every moment counted and the consequences of delay could be permanent. Meanwhile, Denise faced the weight of legal consequences that had finally caught up to her. The charges were severe, encompassing child neglect, endangerment, and possession of illegal substances. Court proceedings began with a stark presentation of the conditions inside the house. Photographs of filth, piles of trash, broken furniture, and the overwhelming evidence of her reckless lifestyle. Testimonies from neighbors and social workers painted a consistent picture of a mother consumed by her addictions and indifferent to the fragile life in her care. The courtroom was tense as the magnitude of her actions unfolded, each detail more damning than the last. The community responded with a mix of sorrow, anger, and reflection. Parents, neighbors, and local organizations began conversations about early intervention, the importance of checking on vulnerable families, and the warning signs that can precede tragedy. The story of the baby in the freezing, filthy home became a catalyst for awareness, shining a light on the consequences of neglect that can remain invisible until it is almost too late. People questioned their own inaction, realizing that even small interventions could prevent suffering and save lives. The tragedy prompted city officials to review child welfare protocols, aiming to ensure that similar situations would be identified and addressed sooner in the future. Despite the mother's arrest and the growing attention to her crimes, the focus remained on the baby and the long road to recovery ahead. Medical staff, social workers, and foster care systems worked together to provide warmth, nutrition, and a safe environment, striving to repair the damage caused by neglect. The child's fragile strength became a symbol of survival against overwhelming odds, a life nearly lost, but not forgotten. As the town slowly absorbed the shock of what had happened, the story remained a haunting reminder that innocence can be left exposed in the harshest conditions, and that vigilance, compassion, and timely action are the only defenses against preventable tragedy.